I'd like to welcome you to the AppSec Village Sandbox. AppSec Village is a volunteer-run community that curates AppSec content for everyone at various conferences. Today, we are really excited to have brought 3 leaders to talk about introducing or including the rest of your organization in your AppSec process. Each of our speakers will share their ideas with you in a 7-minute lightning talk. Please feel free to drop your questions at any time into the chat. I will be collecting them for the Q&A, which will happen after all of the speakers have presented. Our first speaker is Marissa Fagan. Marissa is the head of security at Atlassian, where she runs the program responsible for application security training, security champions, and security culture. Yes, these programs do rely heavily on Jira and Confluence. Previously, she has built similar programs at Synopsys and at Salesforce. She will be presenting Building a Verifiable Application Security Training Program.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marissa Fagan, Head of Security Awareness at Atlassian. In my career, I have built application security training programs in at least 3 different companies, and I've seen the before and the after effects of each of them. Today, I'd like to share with you my lessons learned the hard way so that you can consider those things from the start. Okay, first, let's level set on what I mean by an application security training program. Since it's Thursday of RSA Conference Week, by now you've probably heard a lot about this idea of shifting left for security in the software development lifecycle. This is the practice of weaving security into every step of the software development. In theory, the earliest you can add security in is before the development has even begun. This is that shifting left in the timeline. This is one of the most common places to add security training, with the idea that the developer will learn a paranoid mindset and have the knowledge of what vulnerabilities look like, and therefore try to avoid them, at least the obvious ones. Since you can't measure something that doesn't happen, the effectiveness of a security training program is often measured by capturing whether knowledge has been delivered through quizzes and surveys and sort of capturing the delivery side of the training program. But this is only one part of a complete, balanced, secure software development lifecycle program. So let's get into it. The first lesson I learned the hard way is a tactical one. Make sure that your training platform has the standard learning management system functionalities from the start. You will most likely be buying something, and the platform you want has a mature set of admin tools like enrolling students, tracking performance, sending reminders out, and generating progress reports for managers without making your life harder and doing a bunch of manual tabulations. Some vendors are definitely better than others at this, and if you're in love with a training course, but they don't have any of these admin functions, then you at least need to make sure that they have a proven ability to integrate with one of the standard LMSs that you will have to purchase separately. The one thing that might come up is it could be difficult to identify in the system who is actually a developer. Sometimes titles are not obvious. Being able to carve up that HR data by team, manager, role is going to save you a lot of time in the long run. Okay, secondly, customize the content to your security risks. You absolutely should not just deliver a training course that you bought off the shelf without analyzing first what are the most common vulnerabilities that you see in your own organization, and then verifying that the course actually addresses those issues. And only those issues. Don't train about Swift if you don't have a mobile app. Do not waste developers' time. Only train about the essentials. And if your training is not interactive and hands-on and lab-like, then this is an area that you also need to do some customization in. It's better to buy an interactive, dynamic course from the start than trying to build it yourself. And there are companies out there that are delivering some really cool things. So take the time to get to know all of the vendors in the space and find the one that has the fanciest bells and whistles. It's really going to pay off for your audience. Thirdly, set up a mandatory baseline course that all developers must take first, and then go deeper with developers who are interested optionally later. Okay, so first part, set a mandatory baseline course. This is the course that you spend all of that time customizing for your environment. Many companies don't have any single mandatory course for developers, and they should make sure that they don't have a compliance requirement and a customer expectation that they're skating by on here. This could come back to haunt you later. But maybe you're just interested in the second part, going deeper with developers who are interested in secure coding. I have a couple of ideas for you here. This could be part of a leveling up system or a belt system where there's a learning path and you go deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole with more courses to self-learn with. Or maybe you have a vulnerable web application CTF. Those can be really fun events that get people really excited about security. Or maybe it's a workshop or a brown bag or a learning lab hosted by the product security team once in a while to not only get people excited about security, but introduce the product security team, put a face with a name, that sort of thing. All good things to do to really foster the people that are interested and excited about secure coding once you've got your baseline set. Okay, fourth lesson learned the hard way is to partner with the security champions group early and often. The security champions should be that focus group that you interview for requirements, the pilot group that you test the trainings with, and that street team to get the word out once the training is ready to go. I won't say anything more here about security champions because Nikki is going to go there in great detail next, but they really are the key to everything. And that's it. Those are the 4 things that I learned the hard way that could have saved me a lot of time and pain if I had known from the start. The application security training program is a great way to insert a positive, proactive touch point into your secure SDLC. And if done correctly, you've shifted left with your security program and started the journey off on the right foot. Now you're ready for the next phase, which is weaving just-in-time security training into every activity in the software development lifecycle using these same lessons. Learning is a never-ending journey, and building a verifiable application security training program is a never-ending effort as well. Good luck.
Thanks, Marissa, for getting us started so that we can build amazing teams. Next, we're going to hear from Nikki Brandt. Nikki leads part of Slack's product security organization, where her team has spent years working on building out a network of security champions. She will be presenting simple suggestions for spinning up your first security champions program. Once again, just feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat and we will gather them up later.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Tiffany. I'm so excited to talk with you all about security champion programs and tell you a little bit about what we've learned at Slack from developing, launching, and running our program. For a little more background info for anyone on this call who's not already familiar with security champions, I'm not going to go into depth about what a security champions program is, but you can consider any program designed to deputize engineers in your company to act as agents of the security organization to be a security champions program. We've been working towards a security champions program at Slack for over 2 years at this point, and we just launched our biggest cohort ever this quarter. Looking back across all of the work that we've done on security champions and everything that we've tried, I have 5 pieces of advice that I'd give to someone who was starting a new program from scratch. The first one, it surrounds who you're going to get to be your security champions. Eventually, you're going to get to a point where you don't have a lot of people who really want to be security champions, and maybe you'll have to volunteer some of them. But when you're first starting out for your first cohort, I strongly encourage you to solicit volunteers where possible. Starting with a group of people who are excited to learn about security, excited to work with the security team, means that you're going to get people who are going to come to your trainings, who are going to actually listen to what you're saying, who are going to do any take-home work that you give them. So start with those volunteers. The second piece of advice is to be really specific and really limited in what you are expecting your security champions to do for the security organization. So suppose you found some volunteers who want to be security champions. The next thing that those people are going to have to do after they say, yay, I want to do it, is they're going to have to talk to their managers, and they're going to have to convince their managers that this is an opportunity that the team should provide resources for. You can prepare those volunteers to have that conversation by figuring out exactly what it is you want them to do for you, both in onboarding and after the onboarding program, and how much time those things are going to take. You need to identify what the tasks are that you really need your security champions to do. And then you need to figure out how much time that's going to take. And that's your whole set of asks. At Slack, we ask for 2 hours a week of a security champion's working hours, and we publish a really limited set of tasks that we expect them to do in that time. And that's 2 hours for onboarding and 2 hours once onboarding is over. My third piece of advice is to build in incentives. Again, there's going to be some sort of arrangement between the engineer and their manager to let them participate. And having incentives codified and identified ahead of time can make that a much smoother conversation. You should look to have at least one incentive that will appeal to managers and at least one incentive that it'll appeal to engineers and get more people interested in your program. Some examples of incentives that we've tried out at Slack, on the sort of appealing to managers front, we commit that for every security champion we have, we will provide at least one piece of significant written feedback for them per quarter about their participation in the program. And on the champion level themselves, we allow champions who make it through onboarding to pick out one security book that we then send them for free. So build in incentives at 2 separate levels. So at this point, hopefully you have a couple of volunteers and you've got them committed. What do you do with them now? This might actually be the spiciest suggestion on my slide. I think that you should really focus on basic enablement for your champions and do not try to make every security champion a security expert. Your team are the security experts. Champion doesn't necessarily need to be that. My team has explicitly designed our program in such a way that our champions can be successful at the tasks we've set for them without a deep level of security expertise. So like one of our specific asks is that when a champion's team is introducing a new feature, they work with us to complete a threat model for that feature. In order for champions to be able to meet that ask, we don't need to teach them the intricacies of burp or the specific types of XSS. We just need to teach them how to think about threats. So that's what our education focuses on. Whatever your core tasks are, you should align your onboarding and training for security champions to focus on getting them all up to that same bar. Whether or not they're deeply interested in security, whether or not they're deeply technically engaged with the content, get them all up to that same low bar. And then the last piece of advice comes in. Offer extracurricular opportunities after your onboarding program for security champions who are really interested in the content. In any cohort, we find we have at least a couple of people who are there because they're really interested in security and they want to spend time with the security team learning what we do. Inviting them to team activities such as bug bashes or code jams is a great way to get them involved and help them feel like they're trying out being a security engineer. As Marissa mentioned, it's great to have them as your first audience for trying out new processes or tools, looking at tech specs for projects your team's going to do. All those things can help keep your security champions involved after that initial onboarding. And having them involved after your initial onboarding means that building out your next cohort and getting other people in the organization to hear about your program is going to be that much easier. So once again, my 5 pieces of advice from the top, if you're starting from scratch, start with volunteers for your security champions. Be really specific and limited in what you're asking them to do as security champions. Build in incentives that make them and their managers want them to work with you. Focus on enabling all of them to do the set of specific and limited asks that you identified, and then keep them engaged afterwards with extracurricular opportunities like invitations to bug bashes, events at Hacktober, etc. And that's it. Good luck with your Security Champions program.
Thanks so much for teaching us about Security Champions, Nikki. Our final speaker is Tom Hudson. Tom is a security researcher at Detectify, and he spent years working as a technical trainer teaching recent graduates about security. He also builds tools and tutorials for the hacker community. Tom will be presenting Teaching Security Training for Beginners. Once again, please drop all your questions in the chat and I'll gather them up for the Q&A after.
Thank you, Tiffany. So yeah, my name's Tom. And a few years ago, I found myself tasked with training a group of 20 or so recent graduates. The idea was I had about 8 weeks to get them on their way to being software engineers, just on their way, of course. It wasn't a boot camp, it was an apprenticeship scheme. No one was expecting them to be off writing software all by themselves or anything like that, just to be at the point that they could join a small software team and start to pick things up as they worked on simpler tasks. Something that I think is worth mentioning is that not all of them, in fact, most of them, had not graduated in software engineering related degrees. We'd gone out of our way to accept people from different backgrounds. We just needed them to be enthusiastic about technology. And of course, we needed them to be willing to learn too. I've always been at least a little bit interested in security, so I knew right away teaching them at least a little bit of security was going to be important. How to write secure code was the main thing, but knowing a little bit about how to break things, I think, would be good too. It turns out there's a little bit of a problem teaching security to absolute beginners. If you don't know how a thing works yet, like what JavaScript is and what it does, or what SQL database is, it's really hard to grasp exactly why vulnerabilities happen. And being taught how to prevent them really just feels like being taught a long list of rules you have to follow with no indication as to why. And I think that was one of the things I really disliked about school, being told to follow rules without knowing why they existed. And I don't mean like, don't run with scissors. I mean like, these are the rules you have to follow to solve this equation, or these are the steps to make the computer do this thing that the curriculum says that we have to teach you. I always wanted to know why each rule existed. And what would happen if it wasn't followed? Because I think it's a lot easier to remember to follow the rules if you know why they exist. I eventually think I hit upon a reasonable process to teach these things well enough, which is to tell a story. Talk about how things were before the thing you're teaching about existed. What was the world like before then? What problems did people have because this thing didn't exist? And talk about how the problems were solved. What things did we invent to solve them? But the whole time, explain how things work. I think having an understanding of how things work is one of the best ways to be able to reason about stuff for yourself. It doesn't have to be in excruciating detail, but I think you really need to make sure that you always hit upon all the moving parts of a system and how they interact. That might be a little bit abstract advice-wise, so I think it'd be a good idea if I give you a slightly more concrete example. So early on in our training, after we'd been writing some simple games with JavaScript in the browser, we moved on to writing server-side stuff. I think it was with Node.js, but with what it is, it doesn't really matter. The plan was to quite quickly get to talking about SQL databases, with it, SQL injection. But before we got to that, I pretty quickly found out a lot of people struggled at least a little bit with the distinction between things being client-side or server-side. So I talked about the old web, the web 1.0, or whatever you want to call it, back when the vast majority of the web was static. I talked about the limitations of this static web, where you couldn't easily have things we take for granted, like blog comments, although back then really it was a guest book. But at least without being some kind of Perl guru and knowing about this dark magic called CGI. I talked about the gradual introduction of technologies like PHP and cheap shared hosting that lowered the barrier for entry to server-side programming. Things that let you do like storing data in files on the server, or where that got more difficult to manage using a database. We talked about why databases existed, how the data was organized in them, how you could talk to them to get information you wanted with this query language. Once they all had a mental model for what client and server-side applications and databases were and how the three of them interact, with user data coming from the client-side application, being processed by the server-side application, and ultimately being used to query a database somehow. We had everything in place to be able to actually discuss SQL injection properly. It might seem a little bit excessive to start answering the question, what is SQL injection with? Well, back in the 90s, but you'd be surprised how much history you can cover in just 10 minutes or so. And I distinctly remember when I first wrote some code that queried a database. I think the advice I received was, sanitize your inputs, otherwise SQL injection will happen. I was mostly left to fend for myself, and it never really felt like enough for me. No one told me exactly why that would be an especially bad thing, or even what good enough sanitation actually was. In security, we talk a lot about establishing the root cause of things. And when you teach only about the solutions, it's pretty easy to accidentally label the lack of that solution as the root cause. Like the root cause of a SQL injection vulnerability is you haven't sanitized your inputs correctly. You didn't follow the rule that we taught you, and that's the problem. If you learn how things work and how the moving parts fit together, you're in a much better position to understand the real root cause. I think on some level, I kind of knew the code I wrote years ago was sending this SQL I'd written to a database server, but I didn't really think about it clearly and deliberately. Like many junior developers, I think I just wrote the code, and if it did what I wanted, then that was good enough. But if you know that this query you've put together is sent to the database server all in one chunk and how the moving parts fit together, it becomes easy to understand that the database server has no way of knowing which bit of the query you as the developer wrote and which parts came from the user. No amount of calling MySQL real escape string is going to help with that fundamental problem. And there's always going to be those possible edge cases that slip through the net. But knowing this and how things work makes the solution of prepared statements or parameterized queries make sense. You give the database these two pieces of information in two steps. First, the query you wrote, and second, the data that came from the user. And that lets the database know for sure which part is which and never get confused between the two. I think when it comes to security, you want to teach both sides, red and blue, or offensive and defensive, whatever you want to call it. We didn't just talk about prepared statements. We talked about SQL injection payloads too. Although, again, it wasn't just here's a SQLi polyglot you can try, or run SQL map, or whatever it was. We talked about what the attacker's goals are, what they're thinking, what they're trying to achieve. We told the story of the attacker. And of course, I think everyone also wants to be a little bit like the hackers in the movie, which definitely helps keep people interested too. I think telling a story is a great way to explain things. When you're stuck and don't know what order you should explain things in, chronological is a great way to start because it inherently gives you points to talk about why things exist as well as how they work. And that gives people the ability to reason about systems for themselves instead of being forever dependent on others to feed them the information. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Now that you've had a great set of guides for building an AppSec training program for developers and how to spin up a great champions program, as well as how to tailor your education to absolute beginners, we're going to start taking your questions. I think we're going to put all of us on the screen. And so I'll start with our first question from my list, which is, how can you measure the effectiveness of an AppSec training program?
So it sort of depends on what you're trying to achieve with your AppSec training program. And, you measure what you're trying to define as success. In many cases, it's going to be around coverage and adoption and quiz answers. You want to make sure that you have 100% of your organization taking the training and that 100% have reached a certain bar, like past 70% of the quiz questions, that sort of thing. So those sorts of effectiveness measures are around adoption. And I really think that is the direction to go. There's a lot of talk on whether you should be looking at counting vulnerabilities and looking at the delta between this year and last year for a number of vulnerabilities as a way to describe whether the training program was effective. But you have to look at training more like insurance. It's more proactive and defensive. There's just too many reasons why you might have a different number of vulnerabilities from year to year. It's not, that's not the path I have found to go down. So this is a question of how to scale and measuring the rollout of your training and measuring whether people have knowledge checks. That's how you measure the program.
Well, all right. So our next question, we're going to go with the theme of measurement. And Nikki, what is your, how do you measure the success of a Security Champions program?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say for us, we spent a lot of time before we rolled out our first cohort defining what we call a job description for our security champions. So getting back to that idea of having a really specific set of asks. So there are a couple of different things on that job description, which are activities that we expect the champion to perform on. And we don't actually rate champions on, did they do a particularly amazing threat model? Did their pillar have fewer vulnerabilities or anything? When we report back to their manager on like how valuable they've been, we're literally looking for, did they do those things on our specific asks? I think like Marissa mentioned with security awareness programs, we considered a metric of maybe if we have a security champion, the number of vulnerabilities coming out of their team or their pillar will drop. But it feels like a really variable measure that's not necessarily in the control of a security champion, particularly because some of our security champions are like one person working in a pillar that's 50 people, and it's going to take time for them to exert their influence across that size of a group. We are monitoring that metric, though. We're just not convinced it's going to be a useful gauge of how much impact they've had.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to start with Tom, but I think this is a question everybody can answer. What tactics worked best and what failed in teaching secure coding? And do you think that sprinkling in a little threat modeling to education for developers makes sense?
Sure. So I think one of the tactics that really worked best for the security side of things, at least, was to teach both sides, like say the offensive and the defensive, because if you don't know your opponent, you can't defend against them. For things that failed, I think, like I mentioned, just giving people a list of rules to follow, I think generally speaking doesn't work very well, because firstly, people generally can't remember the rules if they don't know why they exist. For the threat modeling side of things, I think absolutely it's a really good idea, even for beginners as well. When we got to talking about password security, for example, and different hashing mechanisms, we talked about the trade-offs between what you could do depending on who it was you were defending against. So if you were just trying to defend against kids running tools, for example, or if you were trying to defend against a nation state actor, your requirements become quite different. We didn't need to go into too much more depth than that for beginners, but I think using the extremes in that way works quite well to get the point across.
Marissa, did you have any thoughts on it?
I think Tom said it beautifully. As far as what works, hands-on training and making sure that you are looking for courses that have the break stuff and the fix stuff, focusing on both sides. And really it's the patching, how to defend against these issues that developers are really interested in. It helps them connect to the content better. And then as far as what's failed, there's really just no appetite anymore for click-through slides training.
That is the death. Well, okay, so now we've discussed like what works for training developers and how to get them to think about secure coding and what doesn't work. And we've got this idea of building a security champions program to kind of help with our developers having access to security. Why shouldn't we train every security champion to be a full-fledged expert?
Yeah, I think this actually ties really well into one of the other questions that I think Erez asked about security champions and what their responsibilities are. So when we originally polled people about, so Slack has 800 engineers, and before we got started our security champions program, we polled people who had worked in companies that had security champions programs before. And one of the anti-patterns that people brought up was security champions became like an extension of the security team. So when my engineering team had a security problem, I took the heat for it as an engineer on that team. So one of the things that we really want to avoid is putting engineers in that position. They are employed to work on the product. Their expertise is on the product. They shouldn't be taking the blame for security issues. We're at the end of the day, we're the people who are on the line for that. Additionally, I also think that it makes your program more inclusive if you don't require security champions to have that level of interest and passion for security. It's great if you have a couple of people who are that excited, but there are a lot of useful things that a smart engineer can do for you without necessarily being able to go into the weeds on security. So for instance, people hate when I use this term to describe security champions programs, but one of the things that I leverage mine for is as a network of spies or allies throughout engineering. One of the biggest values that I find from the program is that projects that my team otherwise might not hear about, these people have their noses to the wind. They're like, aha, this could be security scary, product security, please help us out. And you don't need to be a security expert to do that. You just need to be a little bit of savvy. And I can teach that to anybody, no matter how passionate they are or aren't.
So then what is the proper audience for developer training? We have a large number of application support members and DBAs that aren't conventional developers. It seems that OWASP training would translate to other roles like on the IT org.
This is such a great question. Thank you for that. It's the next steps. So you start your program thinking about the minimum viable product, and then the sky's the limit. Yes, you absolutely should be looking at other audiences besides strict code, code submitting developers. There are a lot of other technical roles that work in software that need application security training. SEs, a lot of different roles. I really don't think you should think outside the box with that. One that I'll point out in addition to the example that you gave is QA. Giving application security training to your quality assurance, quality engineers, that stage of testing after coding, maybe where there's a handoff to a different team that are not the developers, absolutely AppSec training there as well. And also consider web application pen testing training for QA. If you really want to get advanced and get that high level of maturity in your program, you're on the right track.
I have another question. We're currently working to extend our existing security champion program to include ops folks, which is somewhat straightforward, and products people, which I personally find somewhat more challenging. Is that something you have done or are working on or could share your experience with?
Yes, so I will say my team has mostly worked so far with teams that work directly on the products. So we haven't worked as much with ops yet. We're actually in our current cohort, we have our first set of people from our QE division who, like Marissa said, we expect them to be like really amazing allies, and we have plans to branch out into DevOps. For product people, I'm not sure if you mean like less technical product people, like product managers, maybe. I will speak to that. We've worked with product managers a bit, and right now we're a little too technically focused in our security program or security champions program to loop them in, but their future iteration.
While we're with you, Nikki, what is your recommended ratio of security champions to developers?
Oh yeah, great question. So in an ideal world where everyone would give me resources, I would love to have one security champion per team. Again, just so we have that direct view of here's a project we're spinning up, we need a little help on it. In reality, we have, like I said, we're about 800 engineers right now, and we're at about 35 champions. So I guess that's like around a 1:40 ratio. Maybe I did that math wrong. It's pretty good. It's a lot better than it was before we had that many. So
we have time for one more question in the chat if you'd like. And while we wait for that, what are some of the cool lesser known tools that are a boon for the security team within Slack or Atlassian products?
It's sort of not, in all seriousness, the Atlassian products are what Atlassian leans on quite heavily. Confluence and Jira. We've got a lot of Jira orchestration to create tickets for this work. Security champions are minted with a Jira ticket, and then their process and lifecycle is followed through with a checklist of Jira ticket items and tasks. And you can know what's expected of you based on a tool that you're very comfortable with. But I wanted to also say another tool that's not an Atlassian product. There's some that the really advanced programs are really focusing on automation and orchestration and administration. So we have a tool that captures all of the behaviors and work that everybody's doing. The one that we use is called Elevate, and it's kind of capturing a risk score for employees that is looking at, have you done all of the different tasks that are required of the baseline for all employees? And save yourself some time and just use a tool that is meant and designed for that. Don't build the database yourself.
And is there anything awesome in Slack we should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, this isn't related to security awareness at all, but the first thing that popped into my mind is my team has been rolling out static analysis to a very wide number of programming languages and repos. And we've been using this open source tool called SemGrep, and it's choice. You can write rules for it really easily. It's if you have a security team that needs to put static analysis in place and doesn't necessarily have a lot of background in static analysis, it's a really easy, great tool to use.
Excellent. My next question is for Marissa and Tom. If you had a team that has a very limited budget, what would you recommend when it comes to training?
It's quite a difficult question. I think definitely, as someone said earlier on, don't waste time teaching the things that aren't applicable to your stack. So I think, don't teach Swift security if you don't have a mobile app, for example. But also, I think you can get a surprising amount done with in-house resource. Perhaps if one of your security champions is an expert, maybe they can lend a hand with that kind of thing. But I think the main thing is keep it practical as well, because I think that's the way you get the best bang for your buck. Again, I think it was Marissa said, the click-through slide training is dead. It's expensive to prepare, and it's not very good value for the amount of time invested.
Yeah, there's a couple of some free trainings that some of the vendors make available. So use your network. Ask on Twitter if other people are seeing one-off free trainings that you can weave in. And it's an oldie but a goodie. I just think that Juice Shop, some of the stuff OWASP puts out, it's well-traveled at this point. So there's some good walkthroughs about how to use Juice Shop, the vulnerable web app training platform, to illustrate these concepts, and it feels very hands-on.
That's awesome. So our final question, and then I'll ask if you have anything you'd like to part with, is how big should a security team be when you have 800 engineers?
I think there's a difference between how big it should be and how big it practically can be. I will say for us, our product security team, it's divided in two halves, one that's focused more on secure by default development and one that's focused more on traditional AppSec behaviors. And between the two, we're 19 engineers, which is, I find very well resourced for this number of engineers overall.
Anybody else?
So SANS put out a state of the industry report that talked about having 3 to 4 awareness and training and culture practitioners in your program. And I think that's a number that I've heard at, around like the 5,000 to 10,000 employees, you should start to lean towards having a solid team of maybe 4 people for your awareness and culture program, the topic of this conversation today. So yeah, there's a security awareness programs SANS industry report that just came out very recently that you might look out for if this specific topic area is of interest.
Awesome. So thank you everyone for coming. I hope that you learned a lot. I hope you have 3 excellent jumping off points as you continue to integrate AppSec into the rest of your organization. And if you'd like to follow any of our speakers so that you can learn more about it as they go about their daily lives, please feel free to.